Say every human being on Earth disappeared tonight. Most of the planet would barely notice. The forests would keep growing. Grass would come up through the cracks in the highways. And inside of 100 years, the cities would be green. Out in Kansas, the wheat would be fine too. For a while. It would come up in the spring the way it always does. It would head out in June, turn gold, and stand there in the sun. Then it would wait for something that never arrives. The heads stay shut. Kernel after kernel sits locked in the ear through the wind, through the rain, through the first snow. Still attached to the stalk when the stalk finally goes down. Come back in 10 years and that field is not empty. It is packed. Foxtail, ragweed, brome, volunteer sunflowers 8 feet high. All of it shoulder to shoulder and thriving. Every plant out there is doing fine, except the one the field was named for. This is the most widely planted food crop on Earth. It covers more ground than any other. It supplies something like 1/5 of all the calories human beings eat. And it is very bad at putting its own seed in the ground. It needs a hand. Now go back. Way back. Before the fields. Before the plows. Before anybody thought of a field as a thing you could own. A hand closes around a stalk of wild grass. The stalk is dry and ready. And the second it feels pressure, the whole head comes apart. Seed scatters into the dirt and the grit and the dead leaves. What is left in the hand is almost nothing. That grass lost the ability to plant itself somewhere along the way. The story of everything people had to build to replace it starts at a fire pit in the Jordanian desert. The fire pit is round, about 3 feet across, built out of flat black basalt, laid tight against the ground. It sits in the middle of a building that is half sunk into the earth. Walls of stone, floor paved smooth. Somebody put real work into this place. Somebody meant to come back to it. Outside, this is the black desert of northeastern Jordan. And it is nothing like a desert yet. There is water. There is game. There are wild grasses standing thick enough to walk through. Watch what happens by that fire. Somebody comes in with a basket of seed heads collected off wild grass. And the work starts. The grain has to be knocked loose. Then the husks have to come off. Which on wild cereal means pounding and winnowing and pounding again. Because the hull grips the kernel like it was built to. Then the clean grain goes onto a grinding stone and gets worked into flour with another stone. Back and forth. Back and forth. Until your shoulders burn. Water goes in. The dough gets flattened out thin and laid on a hot stone by the edge of the fire. What comes off it is a flatbread about the size of your palm. Archaeologists pulled 24 charred lumps of food out of the fire pits at this site. It is called Shubaikar 1. And the people who lived there were Natufians. Hunter-gatherers living well before farming took hold anywhere in Southwest Asia. The dates came back at 14,400 years ago. That is at least 4,000 years before the first farms in the region. Bread came first. The farm came later. Under the microscope, the flour turns out to be a mix. Wild einkorn, one of the ancestors of the wheat you know, ground together with the tubers of a marsh plant called club rush. Now, the part that should stop you is not the age. It is the labor. Count what one of those flatbreads costs. Hours of walking and stripping seed off grass that grows in scattered stands. Hours of dehusking. More hours on the grinding stone. All of it for a piece of bread you could eat in about 4 bites. Made from a grain that gives you a fraction of what a good day of hunting gives you. These were people who could still pick up and go. They moved with the seasons and the game. And there were a dozen easier things to eat within a morning's walk. So why bother? Nobody knows for certain. and anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing. It may have been food for gatherings. The thing you put out when several families came together and you needed to feed everybody at once. It may have been worth the trouble simply because grain keeps, and meat does not. It may have been all of that at different times of year. What matters is the pattern it left behind. Once a group decides a stand of wild grass is worth that much work, that stand becomes a place on a map in their heads. They know when it ripens. They know the route. They come back the following year, and the year after, and their children learn the way. The people at Shubaika one built with stone. They set their fires in the same spot twice. One hearth laid right on top of the older one. And they stayed long enough and often enough that the place has kept its shape for 14,000 years. Look at the grinding stones they left behind. The working faces are worn into shallow dishes. That takes years. Not one season. Not one good summer. Years of the same hands doing the same thing in the same place. Picture two stalks of wild wheat growing side by side on a hillside in the Fertile Crescent. Same species. Same height. From 10 feet away you could not tell them apart. Wait until late summer, when both go dry and brittle, and one difference comes out. The first stalk does what wild grass has done for millions of years. The spine of the seed head, the rachis, turns brittle as the plant dries, and it snaps apart on its own. A gust of wind, a passing animal, a hard rain, and the head shatters. Kernels drop into the dirt, where they can work down into cracks and wait for the next wet season. That is the whole plan. That is how a grass gets to be a grass. The second stalk has a defect. Its rachis does not go brittle. Harvest time comes. The head dries out. And it just holds. Wind does nothing to it. The seeds sit there in the air, going nowhere. Out on that hillside. The second stalk is the loser. Its seed never reaches the ground. In any ordinary year, it leaves fewer offspring than its neighbor. And the trait stays rare, hanging on at some low percentage in the wild population and never amounting to anything. Now put a person on the hillside with a flint sickle. Everything about that math inverts. She walks into the stand and starts cutting. Every stalk she touches gets shaken, and every stalk that shatters easily is already half empty by the time it reaches her basket. The seed is on the ground. It is gone. She is not going to crawl around picking kernels out of the dirt one at a time. What she carries home is loaded with the stalks that held on. She is not selecting anything. She is not thinking about the future of a plant species. She is collecting the grain that stayed collectible. Because that is the only grain there is to collect. Most of it gets eaten. Some of it gets held back. Because the stand on that hillside is unreliable, and a handful of seed thrown on disturbed ground near camp is cheap insurance. So she scatters it. And she has just planted a crop that is skewed towards stalks that do not shatter. Next year those plants come up. She harvests them the same way, and the skew gets a little stronger. Then her daughter does it. Then her daughter. Nobody in that chain knew what a gene was. Nobody set out to invent anything. They just kept doing the reasonable thing. And the reasonable thing had a direction to it. Here is where the popular version of this story goes wrong. So let me be careful. This was not one clever village. One lucky season. One moment, somebody figured it out. Genetic and archaeological work points to something slow and messy, playing out across thousands of years, in more than one place, with more than one wild population feeding into the crops that came out the other end. There were probably long stretches where people cultivated wheat that still shattered perfectly well, and nobody noticed a thing. How fast a sickle can push a plant in one direction is still argued over by people who study this for a living. Wheat is also not one plant. Einkorn came first. Emmer came alongside it. Bread wheat, the one behind almost everything in an American grocery store, arrived later still through hybridization. And its full history is a subject for a different video. Strip all that down to what matters here, and you get one line. Over a very long time, the wheat in human hands got worse and worse at releasing its own seed. The crop that came out of it was easier to cut and easier to carry home with the grain still on it. It was not easier to eat. Those early wheats still held their kernels inside tough husks that had to be pounded off. And the varieties that let go of their hulls without a fight would take thousands more years to show up. What people had was a plant that stayed put until somebody came for it, and could not get itself into the ground without help. That fixes something about the people, too, and not in a way anybody chose. The old question was where the food is today. You walked. You looked. You found it or you moved on. The new questions come in a set, and they will not leave you alone. When does the rain come? How much seed is left in the basket? Who is going to help us cut all of this before the weather turns? Answering those means being in one place at one time on purpose. Over and over. For the rest of your life. Start in early winter. In a settlement of round mud and stone houses somewhere in the hills of the Fertile Crescent. And start with an argument. There is a basket of grain in the corner of the house. Everyone in the family knows exactly how full it is. The question on the floor is how much of it goes into the ground. Eat too much of it, and there is nothing to plant. Plant too much of it, and the winter gets long and thin before anything comes up. There is no right answer. Only a bet. And the household has to place it now. Months before anybody finds out how the weather is going to behave. They settle on a number. The seed grain gets set aside. And from that moment, it is untouchable. It sits in the same room as hungry children, and it is not food anymore. Then the rains come and they scatter it. And the work is over. That is the strange part. All that effort. All that risk. And now, there is nothing to do but wait and look at a bare field. Hunting pays you the same day. Gathering pays you the same day. Grain makes you wait half a year to find out whether you were right. So they wait. And they guard. Because birds work the field at dawn and deer come through it at night. And a field that is producing nothing at all still costs somebody a full day. Every day. Green comes up in the spring. Then it goes gold. And everything happens at once. Remember what these people have been selecting for. Season after season. Without knowing it. A crop that holds its seed. A crop that ripens tight and even. That is a gift when you are cutting it, and a problem when you look at how much of it there is. The whole field comes ready inside of a couple of weeks. Cut too early and the grain is soft and will not keep. Cut too late and you start losing heads to weather and to shattering. In between there is a narrow window. And one family cannot possibly get through the field alone in that window. So they go to the neighbors. The neighbors come. Everybody cuts. Everybody threshes. Everybody works past dark. And the field gets in. And now this family owes something. Not in writing. Not with interest. But real. When the family 2 doors down brings their crop in. These people had better show up with sickles in hand. Or they will not get help next year. And without help next year they lose the field. Nobody sat down and designed that. It came out of the harvest window. The grain is in. And the hard part starts. Wet grain molds. So, it has to be turned and dried. Insects get into it. Rodents get into it. and grain draws every hungry thing within a mile, including people from outside the settlement. So they build storage pits lined and sealed, bins raised off the ground on stones, a room with one door. Then comes February. The basket in the corner is down to a hand's depth. There is a child in the house who has been quiet for 2 days, which is worse than crying. And against the far wall, in its own container, sits seed grain, enough for maybe 6 good meals. Somebody in that house is awake, looking at it. Eating it solves tonight. It also erases next year, and the year after that, because there is no store to buy more from, and no neighbor with a surplus in February. Every household in the settlement is doing this same arithmetic in the dark. Whatever they decide, something has changed in that room. There is now food a family cannot eat, sitting in reach of a family that is starving. And the only thing protecting it is a rule everybody has agreed to hold on to. By the end of a good year, there is more of that grain than the households need to get to the next harvest. Extra. People had put food away before this. Hunter-gatherers dried meat, cached nuts, and came back for it. What farming changed was the size of the pile, how regular it was, and the fact that anybody walking through the settlement could see it and estimate it. Which raises a question. Whose is it? Follow what that opens up. Grain keeps, so it can be stored. Stored grain sits in one spot, so it can be measured. Measured grain can be traded for things that are not food. Anything you can trade, you can be cheated out of. Anything you can be cheated out of. Somebody has to guard, and the person who guards the room where the grain is has his hand on everything the settlement will eat between now and the next harvest. That is not a theory about power. That is a floor plan. Push the clock forward now. Past this family, past their grandchildren, into the first cities on the plains of Mesopotamia, where that same room exists at a scale that will break any memory. There is a man sitting with a wet clay tablet on his knee. He presses marks into it with a cut reed. He is not writing poetry. He is not writing prayers. He is writing down how much grain came in, who brought it, which storehouse it went into, and how much went back out as rations to workers and their children. Be careful with this next part, because it gets overstated constantly. Wheat did not invent writing. Writing has more than one thread running into it, and more than one thing going on at once. And a great many of the administrative records from Mesopotamia are counting barley, not wheat, because barley handled the salty, irrigated soils of the south better than wheat did. The honest version is smaller and holds up. Societies that had to remember who owed what and who had already been paid needed a way to remember it that did not depend on anybody's word. So they built one. And the earliest surviving examples of it are overwhelmingly about grain. Go back to the settlement one more time and look at what is standing there now. A room with thick walls, a door that closes, something laid across that door to hold it shut, and a man standing in front of it who is not planting anything, not cutting anything, not grinding anything. He eats because of what is behind him. Summer morning at the harbor complex at the mouth of the Tiber, about 20 miles from Rome. Grain dust hangs in the air thick enough to taste. Wet rope, wet stone. Men on the docks with sacks across their shoulders, moving in a line that does not stop. Warehouses stand back from the water in blocks. And at sundown their doors get locked and sealed by men whose entire job is locking and sealing them. Ships come in from Alexandria and from the ports of North Africa. They unload into barges. The barges go up the Tiber. At the other end, a city is waiting. Here is the number that makes everything else in this chapter necessary. Imperial Rome was the largest city in the world at the time. and most estimates put its population at somewhere around 1 million people. There is no farmland anywhere near Rome that can feed 1 million people. It is not close. The city needed on the order of 200,000 tons of grain a year. And Egypt alone was sending somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 tons of it across open water. Every year. On schedule. That is the whole trick of the Roman capital. It ate a sea. Making that happen required a machine. And the Romans built one and gave it a name. The annona. Rome collected tax grain in Sicily, in Sardinia, in North Africa, and from the time of Augustus onward in Egypt. At the top of the system sat an official called the Prefectus Annone, and his job description tells you where the pressure was. He handled the shipping contracts that moved grain from the provinces to the capital, and he worked to hold down fraud and speculation in the grain market. At the other end of the machine, in the dark before dawn, thousands of Roman citizens were already walking toward the distribution points, and each of them was carrying a small token called a tessera. That token was proof of entitlement. It said this man gets his share. Consider what has happened to a grass that could not scatter its own seed. It is now being counted by imperial officials, priced by speculators, taxed off farmers in 3 provinces, loaded by contractors, insured against loss, and handed out by token to hundreds of thousands of people who have never touched a sickle in their lives. And the Romans knew exactly how fragile the whole thing was, because they spent enormous money trying to make it less fragile. The Emperor Claudius had a harbour dug straight into the coastline north of Ostia, a basin covering some 200 hectares, with 2 long curving arms of stonework reaching out into the sea to break the weather. The harbour needed a lighthouse, and the lighthouse needed a foundation on soft ground. So his engineers took a merchant ship over 300 feet long, one that had already made history hauling an Egyptian obelisk to Rome, and they sank it on purpose. They filled it with concrete and put a tower on top of it. One of the largest ships in the Roman world, deliberately drowned, so that grain ships could come in a little safer. It was not enough. In the year 62, one storm got into that harbour and destroyed 200 ships while they sat inside it. Now watch how fast that reaches the street. Cargo that size gone at once means the reserve in the warehouses starts drawing down. Drawing down means the price of bread in the city moves. The price of bread moving means crowds. And crowds in Rome were not an abstraction. Emperors lost cities over the price of bread. That is why a man of high rank had a full-time job watching grain, and why so many emperors put the annona on their coins next to their own faces. The system held for centuries. Then it came apart. Slowly. And for a long list of reasons. In the years around 430, the Vandals took North Africa, and one of the most important supply lines into the western half of the empire was cut. That did not empty Rome by itself. And anybody who tells you it did is skipping 400 years. The city had been shrinking already. There were civil wars, sackings, plagues, aqueducts nobody was repairing, and an imperial treasury that had stopped functioning. The grain was one strand in a rope that was fraying everywhere at once. But it was the strand that mattered for size. Medieval Rome held about 30,000 people. They grazed their animals in the ruins of the Forum. 1 million. Down to 30,000. In the same city. On the same hills. With the same river running through it. Rome had not forgotten how to build. The hills were where they had always been. And so was the river. What the city no longer had was the sea route and the offices and the contracts and the locked warehouses. and without those it fell back to the size the land around it could support. Northern Illinois. Sometime in the 1850s, a farmer has his wagon loaded, and he is driving it toward a tall wooden building standing next to a set of railroad tracks. He knows this wheat. He knows which field it came out of and what the weather did to it in June. If you asked him, he could tell you which part of the load came off the low ground. He pulls up to the building and a man waves him forward. And the wagon gets tipped into a hopper. His wheat goes down a chute, into a leg of buckets, up the inside of the building, and out into a bin where several hundred other men's wheat is already sitting. That is the last anybody will ever see of his wheat as his. He is not getting those kernels back. Nobody could find them if they wanted to. What he walks away with is a piece of paper that says a certain number of bushels of a certain grade are on deposit in that elevator. The wheat lost its name and picked up a number instead. That was a decision made by men in a room, and it solved a real problem. Grain used to travel in sacks, because sacks were the only way to keep track of whose was whose. Sacks are slow, and they have to be handled by hand at every transfer. Pour the grain in loose, and a rail car holds far more and moves far faster. But the moment you pour several farms together, ownership turns into a puzzle. In 1856, the Chicago Board of Trade solved the puzzle. They set out 3 quality categories for wheat and wrote down the criteria for sorting a load into one of them. Once that existed, a warehouse receipt stopped pointing at a particular pile in a particular bin. It pointed at a grade. Number 2 spring wheat was number 2 spring wheat, and its price did not care whether it came from farmer A, farmer B, elevator C, or rail car D. The word for that is fungible. 1 bushel is as good as any other bushel inside the grade. The way $1 bill is as good as any other dollar bill. Take a second with what that did for the man with the wagon. Because it was real and it worked in his favor. He could sell his crop to a buyer in Buffalo or Liverpool who would never lay eyes on it, and sell it without shipping it first. He could take that receipt to a bank and borrow against it, which meant he did not have to dump his entire crop the same week. Every other farmer in the county was dumping theirs. A wheat field in Illinois got wired straight into a bakery 2,000 miles away. It is one big reason grain became so cheap and so abundant in this country. Now look at what came in the door alongside it. The grade was everything, and the grade was decided by the elevator. The men working inside those buildings figured out very quickly what could be done with a system where wheat is judged by a category and then poured into a common bin. In 1861, after warehouse operators covered up a large quantity of spoiled grain and mixed it into good grades, open accusations of fraud started flying in Chicago. The men who did that kind of work had a nickname in the trade. They were called wheat doctors, and the farmer had almost nothing to push back with. The elevator company set the hours it would receive grain. The elevator company applied the grade. The elevator company decided how much to dock him for moisture or trash in the load, and set the storage rates. The railroad decided the freight rate and decided whether there was a car available for him this week. In plenty of towns, the same interests owned the elevator and had the good rail connection. And there was one place to sell and one price to take. So he stands there on a fall morning with a full wagon and a crop that took him a year. And a man he has never met walks over, looks at his load, and says a number out loud. There is no arguing with the number. The wheat is already halfway up the leg. That system never went away. It got bigger. Go look at the bread in your kitchen. There is no farm behind that loaf. There is no field, no county, no family name. There is a grade, and a mill, and a receipt. And somewhere upstream of all of it, A few hundred farmers whose wheat went into the same bin and stopped being theirs. Kansas. Sometime after midnight, a combine the size of a house is working a field with its lights on. One person sits in the cab, in air conditioning, watching a screen that maps the yield by the square yard. The headlights throw a hard white wall out in front of the header, and chaff and dust come up through the beams like smoke. Everything past the lights is black. That machine will do in one afternoon what took the family in Chapter 3 their entire village and every hour of daylight in the harvest window. Look at what it is actually driving into. Millions of stalks standing upright, every one of them still holding its seed. The heads are dry and ready, and none of them are letting go. Because the spine of the ear does not go brittle the way wild grass does. That trait showed up as a defect in a handful of plants on a hillside. And it got carried forward by people cutting grain with flint. And it is the only reason there is anything left in that field to harvest at 1 in the morning. Wheat did not build civilization by itself. And anybody who tells you it did is selling something. Rice carried enormous populations across Asia. Maize did it in the Americas. Millet and sorghum did it in Africa. Cities came up around all of them. But across a belt running from Western Asia through North Africa and into Europe, every time people wanted to hold on to this particular grass, or count it, or move it somewhere far away, they ended up building something that had not existed before. A sealed room, a clay tablet, a harbor with a ship sunk under the lighthouse, a grading system, and a piece of paper worth as much as the grain. The combine reaches the end of the row. The header lifts. The machine swings around in the dark, drops the header again, and starts back the other way. Subscribe if you want the next one. And here is something to try. Find out what is actually growing within 20 miles of your house. Most people have no idea. Put it in the comments.